In order to use 4coder's built-in project system, you need to add a project.4coder file to your code somewhere. The first thing that should appear in your project file is a version specifier. The prior project system didn't use a version specifier, so if no specifier shows up, it is assumed to be version 0. The new project system in 4coder 4027 is version 1. So, to specify that this project is a version 1 project, we simply type version 1 with parentheses around the number, as shown right here. To give your project a name, simply take the project name variable, as spelled right here, and assign a string to it. For this project, I'll call it tutorial. The project name is useful in a couple of ways. Primarily, it shows up on the Windows title bar for the 4coder window, and it is also displayed when the project is loaded on the messages buffer, so that you can verify that you've loaded the correct project. Your project can specify file patterns that it will use to decide which files to load and which files to not load. By default, it won't load any files, so you need to add patterns that you do want loaded by adding a patterns variable, which is an array of strings, specified as follows. Patterns equals, and an open and close brace with a semicolon, and then a string and a comma to separate each individual string. So for instance, if I want to load all .cpp files, I will include a pattern that says star.cpp. This pattern loads CPP files because the star acts as a wildcard and says any file that has a name followed by .cpp will match this particular pattern and be loaded. I'll go ahead and paste in the rest of the patterns for this project. There's also another option for patterns, which is to specify files you don't want loaded. This can be useful when it's possible that a file or folder might match one of the patterns you've provided, but you don't want it to be loaded. Especially for folders that you don't want to be loaded, this option is useful since all folders are loaded, even those that don't match this pattern here, when using a recursive load. So, including blacklist patterns gives you the option to say certain files and folders should not be considered while loading files. Again, it's just an array of strings, and in this case the most common thing you'd probably want to put in here is just a dot star saying don't load any hidden files and don't recurse into any hidden folders. Especially useful if you're using some kind of repository or source control that uses hidden files or hidden folders to keep track of metadata. In order to have the code files for your project loaded, your project file needs to specify the paths to the code. To do this, use a load paths variable, which is an array of compound data types. The compound data has several features. The first feature that we should go over is the operating system matching feature. With this feature, you can specify for every set of paths that you might want to specify which operating system those paths are used on. So for example, this is set up so that whatever path is specified in this compound will only be applied on the Windows operating system. Similarly, you can also ask for Mac or Linux as the specified operating system to match against. Without this, none of the paths will be used. You have to include one of these. If you end up wanting to work on every operating system available, you can simply include a separate compound for each operating system as shown here. The other member of this compound is the .paths member. This member has an array type, so we will use braces to specify it. Optionally, you can leave off the .paths in this case because it is understood that the .paths member is always the first member of the compound if it is unlabeled. Inside these braces, we're specifying an array. I'm going to give us an extra line in between to give us a little more space to keep track of which braces specify what things. Inside this array, we're specifying the actual paths that we want to specify. Now, each path can have several settings put onto it. So, for example, the following is a relative path that I load recursively. What does all of that mean? Well, the dot at the beginning in the string is just specifying the actual text of the path, the actual string for the path. I specify it as a relative path, which means relative to the project file. Wherever the 4coder project file is stored, that's where the root of the relative paths is, from which the rest of the string is appended. So in this case, I'm saying from where my project file is, I want to load files. And I'm saying I want to do it recursively. So from where this project file is, load all of the files at this level and recurse down the folders and load all the files in those levels. Of course, all the while following the pattern and blacklist pattern rules that are specified for the project. Optionally, you can also, of course, use absolute paths by setting relative to false, in which case you could include such paths as foobar, or if you were on Linux, perhaps foobar. In order to add built-in commands to my project, I need to specify a command list. Command list is just an array that contains compounds for each of which specifies one command. Each command is going to get pretty long, so I'm going to space this out a little bit. Inside this command, the first thing I need to specify is a name for the command. This is done with the .name member and string. I'll call this a build command, because we're going to use it to actually build the code in this tutorial project. A couple of other settings I can set on a command include an output buffer, a footer panel option, a save dirty files option, and a cursor at end option. The out option specifies what buffer will receive the output from the command as it is running. For a build command, I'll send the output to the compilation buffer. Footer panel determines whether or not the output is shown in a full-size panel or in a panel at the bottom of the screen. For a build, I like to use a footer panel. The Save Dirty Files field determines whether or not all of the files loaded in 4coder should be saved if they have unsaved changes before running the build command. The cursor at end option will determine where the cursor goes as more output comes from the process that has been invoked by the command and into the output buffer. For the build command, I'll set this to false. I need to specify the true heart of the command, which is the actual command line command that needs to be executed when I want this command to run. I do this with a .cmd member, which will have an array of operating system options, sort of like the load paths does. So it gets specified in this way with a pair of braces. Inside these braces, we can include multiple compounds. For instance, I could include one command for the Windows operating system and another command for the Linux operating system. In order to set the actual text of the command that I want to run, I simply put a string at the beginning of the command, and that string can be any string that I could run on the command line. So for instance, perhaps on Windows I want to run build.bat, whereas on Linux I want to run build.sh. Again, I'm only setting up a Windows option for this tutorial project, so I'll remove this example now. But like with the other operating system matcher in the load paths, this supports Windows, Linux, and Mac. So in addition to this build command, I want to specify a run command so that I can run my code from 4coder too. You can see I've changed the name to run. I'm going to send the output to a run buffer. For the run buffer, I won't send it to a footer panel, and I won't have it save dirty files, and you know, I will send it, I will have the cursor stay at the bottom as output comes from the command. Finally, I need to change what I actually am running. I don't want to run build.bat when I'm trying to run the program. Instead, I'll go into my build folder and I'll run the tutorials binary. So that specifies the commands I want in my project, but finally I have to set which commands are bound to which keys. In order to do that, I include an F key command with an index down here. Technically it could go anywhere. And I specify the name of the command that I want to run. So for instance, on F1 I want to bind my build command, so I say that F key command 1 is build, as you can see right here. That'll pair it up with this command up here. Similarly, I'm going to set F key command 2 to run. So now when I've loaded this project, I should be able to hit F1 to build my code and F2 to run it. Furthermore, when I load the project, it should load all of the code for my entire project, as long as I've specified my paths and patterns correctly. Composing the pieces of the project system starts to get difficult, either because there are particularly long strings or lines involved in your configuration, or because there's redundant and duplicated features all over the place. The project system actually supports a concept of variables that you can use to specify variables that aren't built in but that get reused in other places. So for instance, this load paths array is a little bit unwieldy. We can tame it a little bit by saying, how about we pull that off into a load paths win and keep this array right here. Now we can see that when we are looking at our configuration, that load paths win are the paths we load for the Windows operating system, and we can just put that variable in the place of where we were specifying that compound before. The system automatically parses that variable and determines that it needs to go and look up the value assigned to it to figure out what the compound placed there actually looks like. This is also useful when you have particularly long commands. For instance, if we thought this command line command here was too long, we could say, here's how we run on Windows, and pull that out into a separate variable. With a 4coder project specified, the default behavior of 4coder is that you can load your project by using the extended command Alt-X followed by load project. When you run this command, 4coder will look at the current hot path and look for a project.4coder file. If it finds one, it will set it to the current project, like so. You can see that all of the files in my tutorial project were automatically loaded because they matched the patterns and were in the path I specified. You can also see that the messages buffer has showed me all the details about my project. So if I am having any trouble figuring out why something isn't behaving correctly, I can verify that the details are getting into the 4coder project system in the way that I think they are by looking at this feedback here. For instance, I can see that the root directory of the project, where the project file was loaded from, was 4ed/tutorial project. I can see the project name, I can see the patterns that I specified and the blacklist patterns. I can see the load paths that I specified, and you can see it's gone ahead and put in the defaults that I left out. So even though I didn't specify that I was using .paths member when I put the string in, it went ahead and put the .paths member in anyway. It also put in the .recursive and .relative members, which I let go to the default values of true in my actual project file. You can also see the command list, which has all of the members specified for each command. Here you can see what it looks like when I load a project when I have forgotten to include the version number up here at the top. You can see it says that I loaded a project file, but all of the members of the various fields look completely wrong. For instance, my project name is just my root directory, my patterns and blacklist patterns are both empty, and the load paths here, it doesn't have my relative path, but rather an absolute path to my root directory. all my commands are also missing. This is what it looks like when 4coder thinks that it's loading a version 0 project and you try to specify a version 1 project. I can fix this, of course, by simply adding version 1 to my project so that when it loads, I get all the details that I'm supposed to, because 4coder understands that this is a version 1 project now. Here I have a project file with various syntax and setup errors that you might accidentally make while trying to set up your 4coder project. Let's see what happens when I try to load it. So you can see that it tried to do its best to make some sense out of what was there, but it emitted some errors so that we can track down our mistakes. I'm going to highlight this first error here in the messages buffer and press enter to skip to it. So you can see it brought me over here. Let me read what the error said. It expected an equal token for assignment, and you can see that indeed the problem here is that I did not use an equals token while I was setting up this assignment for this variable. Let's look at what the next error says. Encountered an unlabeled member after one or more labeled members. So one rule you have to watch out for is when you're setting up a compound data type, the members that have names, such as .os, have to come after ones that you leave unlabeled, like this one here. If I put .os first and then the unlabeled one, it has no way of knowing whether the unlabeled one is supposed to be index 0, index 1, so it's not very clear to the parser what you mean by that, and it just ignores that member. On the other hand, if you put the unlabeled members first, it just goes ahead and assumes that they're in order 0, 1, 2, 3 until the first labeled member shows up, after which it can no longer be unlabeled. Let's see what the next error says. This is an error that is letting me know that my command needs to have a name. It won't use this command for anything if it doesn't have a name. So it's just an error that reminds me to add a name to my command in case I forgot. What's the last error say? This one says it wasn't able to find any command strings in this match list that it could actually use. What it means by that is that I'm on the Windows operating system, but the only one it couldn't find any strings specified in this list that were matched with Windows, right? I've said that here it's Linux. If I switch this to match with Windows, it should now be able to find that when I try to reload the project. After fixing all those errors, I can just run load project again, and there it is. I have my project, and this time all of the features have come in correctly. The project name is specified, load paths is filled correctly, and the command list is not completely empty as it was up here, just being filled with all zeros, as you can see. So that's some pretty common errors that you should expect to find, and if you try to use this jump to error thing and it's not working for you, the way you can interpret this is it tells you that this error happened in a project.4coder file. Then it tells you that it happened on line number 3, 19, 25, and 31, etc. And then it gives you a column number in case you need to interpret these up on your own. The loaded project, the default behavior is that you can run your commands as you bound them at the bottom of your project file, or wherever you put this particular variable, with the F1, F2, and etc. keys that pair up with the indexes you gave when you set them down here. So for instance, if I hit F1, it will run my build command, which means it's sending output to a compilation buffer, and it is sending it to a footer panel, and so on. As we can see, we can confirm that all of these settings are mapping directly to the command I get when I hit F1. Similarly, if I hit F2, it will run my application, which prints out this nice Hello World alternative called Tutorial Example. If you're creating your own customization for 4coder, you can use the project system by going through the following calls displayed over here. These calls are in the file 4coderprojectcommands.cpp. To load a project, set current project from nearest project file is the simplest option available. This call just takes an app pointer and a partition pointer. It can be called from anywhere by saying set current project from nearest file, app address of global part. What it does is it searches at the current directory and then at the ancestor directories going to the parent and the parent's parent and so on until it finds a project.4coder file, and then it loads it and sets it as the current project that is actively used. Alternatively, you can set the current project using setCurrentProject_from_data. This allows you to set a string of any text that you got from any source you want. Using this method, you wouldn't need to name your file project.4coder, and you wouldn't even necessarily need to get your configuration string from a file at all. You could get it from any source that you want. You could pass the string in here, and then it would set the current project from the data that you passed in. Once you've set the current project, you can execute the commands specified in that project using the call execProjectFkey command. When you call this without a current project set, nothing will happen, as you can see here at the top. The parameters to this are just the app links and then an index. The index being the index that correlates with the index you set in the configuration of the project.